Fiona Myers had spent most of her life believing that love was something you earned by being useful. At 34 years old, she had just sold her architecture firm for $14 million, a company she had built from nothing more than talent exhaustion and years of sacrifice. 8 years earlier, she had started with a tiny rented office above a dry cleaner, one second-hand drafting table, and $11,000 in savings. She worked impossible hours designing sustainable commercial buildings, converted warehouses, libraries, and office complexes, while also somehow carrying the invisible labor of her entire family. Her mother depended on her for property taxes because she never learned how to file them herself. Her father relied on her to quietly cover expensive golf membership renewals. Whenever he forgot, her younger sister Kelsey leaned on her for wedding planning, vendor negotiations, permit issues, and every logistical disaster that appeared. Fiona handled all of it without complaint, because somewhere along the way she had confused being needed with being loved. Every phone call from her family came attached to a task. Every text message was another responsibility waiting to be solved. She had become the family's operations department, the invisible backbone nobody thanked, because they assumed she would always be there. Kelsey, meanwhile, played the role of public relations, smiling at events, posting photos online, organizing social calendars, and appearing emotionally connected to their mother. Because she handled the visible things, Fiona handled the messy things, the paperwork, the bills, the emergencies, the inconvenient problems nobody wanted to deal with. For years, she told herself this was simply what families did for each other. Then, on the night her acquisition deal officially closed, her husband Garrett sat across from her at the kitchen table while the champagne slowly went flat, and asked a question that shattered something inside her. When was the last time anyone in your family called you without needing something? Fiona tried to answer immediately, but couldn't. Later that night, she went through months of phone records and text messages. 43 calls from her mother in 8 months. Every single one involved a favor, a task, or some problem requiring Fiona's attention. Not one call existed just to ask how she was doing. Not one message said, "I'm proud of you," or "I miss you," or "How are the kids?" She realized she had spent years functioning more like unpaid staff than a daughter. Garrett didn't tell her her family was cruel. He simply suggested one thing before telling them about the money: stay quiet for 1 week and see who notices her beyond what she provides. Fiona hated the idea because it felt manipulative, but she also couldn't ignore the truth staring her in the face. So instead of announcing the successful sale, she texted her mother saying the acquisition had fallen through and she was having a rough week. Deep down, she hoped this would finally create the kind of emotional conversation she had secretly wanted her whole life. Maybe her mother would call immediately. Maybe her father would ask if she was okay. Maybe Kelsey would stop talking about centerpieces long enough to care about her sister's pain. Instead, 14 minutes later, her mother replied only to ask whether Fiona could still handle the caterer, because Kelsey was stressed about the wedding. That was it. No concern, no sympathy, no questions. Fiona stared at the message in silence, while Garrett watched her face slowly fall apart. Her entire career had supposedly collapsed, and the family's first instinct was making sure their unpaid problem solver was still operational. The next few days became even worse. Her father gave her a distracted 30-second phone call before hanging up for dinner and never calling back. Kelsey texted paragraphs about floral arrangements and bridesmaid schedules, burying a quick "that sucks" about Fiona's ruined deal somewhere between conversations about peonies and centerpiece colors. Fiona realized with painful clarity that her family did not know how to relate to her outside of what she could do for them. She wasn't treated like a person with emotions, exhaustion, dreams, or pain. She was a utility, a resource, a safety net everyone assumed would always exist. While her mother posted glamorous wedding updates online with captions about mother of the bride energy, Fiona sat alone, scrolling through social media like a stranger watching another family live a happy life. She noticed something heartbreaking. Her mother documented Kelsey constantly dress fitting, champagne toasts, bridal dinners, smiling selfies. Fiona wasn't missing from those moments because she was physically absent. She was missing because she had never been seen that way to begin with. She was useful behind the scenes, not meaningful in front of the camera. Still, despite the hurt growing heavier each day, Fiona continued solving problems out of habit. She handled the florist decisions perfectly. She reviewed contracts. She fixed scheduling conflicts. She chose arrangements that wouldn't block sight lines in the venue because years as an architect had trained her to notice structural issues everywhere. Even while emotionally collapsing, she kept performing flawlessly because usefulness had become her identity. But for the first time in her life, every completed task filled her with resentment instead of satisfaction. Then came the moment that changed everything permanently. Within days of believing Fiona's business deal had failed, her mother converted Fiona's childhood bedroom into an Airbnb listing for $89 a night. The room still contained the window seat Fiona had built herself when she was 16 years old. The message was impossible to misunderstand. Her place in the family had become financially inconvenient. By the end of the week, Kelsey uninvited her from the wedding after. Their mother suggested it would be awkward if Fiona attended empty-handed. After her failed business situation, their father simply stopped calling altogether. Fiona realized that the moment she appeared unable to provide value, the family system quietly began removing her from it. 11 days earlier, she had been worth $14 million, yet the people closest to her treated her like a burden. The second they believed the money was gone, Garrett watched all of it happen in stunned silence. He had spent years suspecting Fiona's family loved her conditionally, but even he hadn't expected the cruelty to reveal itself so quickly. Then on the 12th day, he did something Fiona never saw coming. Without telling anyone beforehand, Garrett wired $50,000 to each member of her family. What happened after they received the money became the final proof Fiona could never unsee. Suddenly her phone exploded with calls, affection, invitations, apologies, and emotional speeches about family loyalty. Her mother cried about how worried she had been. Her father suddenly wanted to reconnect. Kelsey talked about how stressed wedding planning had made everyone and how misunderstandings happen in families overnight. Fiona transformed from disposable inconvenience back into beloved daughter and sister, all because money had entered the conversation again. And that was the part Fiona could never forget. The speed of their warmth returning was horrifying because it exposed a truth she had spent years avoiding. Their love existed most clearly when resources existed too. The realization haunted her long after the money stopped mattering. She had built a multi-million-dollar company while desperately trying to earn affection from people who only seemed to value her when she was useful, generous, or financially beneficial. And sitting awake late at night beside her sleeping children, Fiona began wondering whether the saddest part of the story was not that her family used her, but that she had spent so many years believing that was all she deserved from love. After Fiona learned that her childhood bedroom had been turned into an Airbnb rental only days after her family believed her business deal had collapsed, something inside her finally began to crack in a way that could never fully heal. The discovery came through an old college friend named Jess, who casually sent her a screenshot asking if the listing she found online belonged to Fiona's parents' house. Fiona opened the link expecting confusion, but instead found 3 polished photographs of the room she had grown up in. Clean white bedding covered the bed where she used to study late into the night as a teenager. A vase of dried lavender sat neatly on the nightstand she had painted herself at 12 years old. The biggest shock was the window seat beneath the bedroom window, the one Fiona had built with her own hands at 16. While her father stood beside her teaching her how to use his tools, she still remembered him smiling proudly and saying measure twice, cut once, while helping her sand the edges smooth. That small memory had once felt sacred to her, proof that her father saw her, understood her, believed in her talent long before she became successful. But now the seat had been redecorated with decorative pillows and a small sign that simply said guest. Her mother's listing described it coldly as a recently refreshed, charming daughter's old room with garden view. Recently refreshed. Fiona realized her mother had removed every trace of her existence. Within days, the plaque with her name was gone from the door. The bookshelves had been rearranged. Her childhood had been staged into rentable aesthetics for $89 a night. Garrett stood beside her reading the listing over her shoulder, his face tightening as the reality settled in. Fiona expected him to call her mother cruel, but instead he said something far worse because it felt true. She isn't punishing you, he told her quietly. She's reallocating the space your room was assigned to you, and now you've been unassigned. The words hit harder than anger ever could. Garrett explained it the same way someone would explain office management or company restructuring, and her mother's system and used resources did not. remain idle. If something stopped contributing value, it was reassigned. Fiona's room was no longer serving a purpose, so it became inventory. It wasn't emotional, it wasn't personal, it was operational efficiency. That realization haunted Fiona more deeply than outright cruelty ever could, because cruelty at least requires emotion. This felt mechanical, organized, rational. Her family had not exploded in anger after believing she lost her business deal. They had simply adjusted around her absence, as if she were an employee whose contract had ended. The next few days only reinforced the pattern. Fiona tried calling her father and got sent straight to voicemail. She texted him just to ask how he was doing, but although the read receipt appeared hours later, no response ever came. That same evening, she saw a Facebook photo of him smiling proudly beside Kelsey at her wedding venue walkthrough, standing in front of a white gazebo with the caption, "Proud Dad." Moment. Fiona stared at the image for a long time, realizing that her father had not stopped being emotionally available altogether. He was simply emotionally available to the active project. Kelsey's wedding was current, visible, socially important. Fiona's life had become inconvenient background noise. When he finally answered her call the next day, his voice sounded distracted and rehearsed, like a customer service employee trying to clear pending tasks before ending a shift. He awkwardly explained that he and her mother were busy with wedding planning and asked her to understand. That word destroyed her. Understanding had become her assigned role in the family. She was expected to understand neglect, understand dismissal, understand silence, understand why everyone else's needs came first. Even processing their indifference had become emotional labor. She was expected to perform for them. After the call ended, Garrett told her something she desperately wanted to reject, but could not. "Your father doesn't make decisions," he said. "He routes them. Your mother stopped forwarding your file to him." Fiona hated hearing her parents described like corporate systems, yet every example proved Garrett right. Her father wasn't intentionally cruel. He had simply spent decades functioning inside the emotional structure her mother controlled. If Diane Myers didn't prioritize something, nobody else did either. Fiona remembered being 16 years old, building that window seat while her father proudly guided her hands and praised her craftsmanship. He had once told her she had good hands, and she realized with painful clarity that he had not spoken to her with that kind of warmth in nearly 2 decades, not because he stopped loving her, but because nobody had instructed him to express it. Then came the message from Kelsey that shattered whatever hope Fiona still carried. Her sister texted her one morning explaining that their mother thought it might be better if Fiona skipped the wedding because, given the situation with her failed business deal, showing up without a proper wedding gift would make things awkward for everyone. Fiona read the message over and over, stunned by how transactional the logic felt in her mother's calculations. Fiona no longer had financial value, which meant she represented social embarrassment at an expensive wedding. Therefore, the cleanest solution was simply to remove her from the event entirely. It wasn't even personal hatred, it was management. Fiona had spent 4 months organizing Kelsey's wedding, vendors, fixing permit problems, negotiating logistics, selecting centerpieces, coordinating florists, and saving the entire event from multiple disasters. But none of that labor mattered because her mother's system only counted visible contributions, money, appearances, status. Fiona's unpaid effort disappeared from the ledger the second her income appeared. Uncertain, Garrett later sat with her at the kitchen table and drew an actual organizational chart on printer paper. At the top, he wrote Diane Myers, CEO. Beneath that, he split the family into departments. Fiona represented operations, taxes, logistics, permits, maintenance, crisis management. Kelsey represented public relations, appearances, social events, Instagram posts, community relationships. Their father occupied administrative support, forwarding requests, and cushioning decisions without ever creating them himself. Fiona stared at the page in horror because every relationship in her life suddenly made sense. Every birthday, every holiday, every phone call fit perfectly into the structure. Her family did not function emotionally, it functioned operationally. Garrett finally said the sentence Fiona had been avoiding for years. "Your family isn't a family," he told her gently. "It's a company, and you just got laid off." The truth became impossible to ignore after Nora, Fiona's senior architect and close friend, secretly sent her screenshots from a private group chat called Myers Family Updates, a chat Fiona herself had never been included in despite existing for over 2 years. Reading the messages felt like watching executives discuss a failing employee. Her mother informed everyone that Fiona's company had gone under, and she probably couldn't contribute to the wedding fund anymore. Kelsey's immediate concern was whether she needed to Find another florist coordinator now that Fiona might not be available, her father responded by saying they should simply give Fiona space and trust she would figure it out. Nobody asked if she was emotionally okay. Nobody worried about her mental health. The only concern was resource management and task replacement. Then Fiona reached the message that finally broke her heart completely. Enlisting the spare room her mother had written, no point keeping it empty if she's not contributing anymore. Not contributing anymore. Fiona read those words repeatedly until they stopped feeling like sentences and started feeling like a diagnosis. Her mother did not remove her room because she hated her. She removed it because inactive assets get reassigned. The same family still asking Fiona to coordinate wedding vendors behind the scenes was simultaneously discussing replacing her. In private conversations, they continued using her labor while preparing for her removal. It wasn't emotional betrayal in the dramatic sense, it was colder than that. It was efficiency. And once Fiona fully understood that, something inside her shifted permanently. That night she sat across from Garrett feeling emotionally numb as she repeated the word contributing over and over like she was reading a technical report instead of describing her own life. Garrett quietly told her that she had finally seen the family production schedule for what it truly was. After hours of silence, Fiona picked up her phone and called Claudia, the attorney who handled the sale of her company. Her voice was calm, almost detached, as she instructed Claudia to establish trusts for her children and prepare 3 separate wire transfers for $50,000 each, one for her mother, one for her father, and one for Kelsey. Claudia paused in confusion because she had witnessed the coldness of Fiona's family firsthand during the acquisition celebration months earlier. Carefully, she asked whether Fiona was certain about the decision. Fiona looked around her quiet kitchen at the wedding invitations still hanging on the refrigerator despite everything and realized she already knew exactly what would happen next. The money would not heal the family. It would simply reactivate the system. Fiona spent the next several days moving through her life like someone slowly translating a language she had spoken her entire life without ever truly understanding. Every new discovery peeled back another layer of the system her family had built around her, and every layer revealed the same painful truth. In the Myers household, love was measured through usefulness, contribution, and performance. Garrett had called the $50,000 transfers closing payments, not gifts, and the phrase stayed with her because it sounded disturbingly accurate. After 9 years of unpaid labor, emotional management, financial rescue, and endless availability, the money felt less like generosity and more like the final invoice on an account she no longer intended to keep open. When she hung up with Claudia after arranging the transfers, Fiona stood in front of the refrigerator staring at Kelsey's wedding invitation still hanging beneath a sunflower magnet, cream envelope, gold lettering, her name written in elegant calligraphy, like she still belonged in the picture being painted. She couldn't bring herself to remove it yet because some small exhausted part of her still mourned the version of family she had spent decades trying to believe in. Garrett understood that silence and didn't pressure her. He simply let her stand there while the kitchen clock ticked through another evening in the house. She herself had designed a house built with intentional light, careful angles, and foundations strong enough to survive storms. Fiona had spent her life building structures meant to last, while her mother built relationships that functioned more like ledgers. On the 9th day, Jess sent another screenshot. Fiona's childhood bedroom, now renamed the Garden View Suite, had received its first Airbnb review. 5 stars, lovely room, charming window seat. Diane was a wonderful host. Fiona stared at the words until her vision blurred. A stranger had slept in the room where she once dreamed about becoming an architect. A stranger had rested against the window seat she built by hand at 16 while her father taught her how to measure wood correctly and secure clamps without splitting the grain. Her mother had transformed years of memory into a rentable experience and even rebranded it for better marketing. Fiona noticed something almost absurdly heartbreaking. When she actually lived in that room, it never had a special name. It became valuable enough to brand only after she stopped belonging there. Garrett read the review quietly and said the same thing he always did, the truth without decoration. She's monetizing the vacancy. Fiona repeated the phrase in her mind for hours afterward. Monetizing the vacancy, turning absence into revenue, converting a daughter into square footage. That night she sat at her drafting table for the first time since selling her company and sketched the window seat from memory, every detail still living perfectly in her hands, the mortise joints, the angled back support she designed intentionally, so leaning against it felt like resting against a tree. She remembered the smell of sawdust in the garage, remembered her father handing her the chisel, remembered him smiling proudly and telling her she had good hands. 18 years later, those same hands had built a $40 million business, but somehow the only thing her family seemed able to measure was whether she was still financially useful to them. Her father's tools still sat untouched in the garage, while her childhood room collected five-star reviews from strangers. Fiona found herself wondering whether the room had ever truly belonged to her at all. The emotional exhaustion started affecting even the smallest parts of her daily life. One evening, her daughter, Mabel, asked innocently whether they were still going to Aunt Kelsey's wedding. Fiona gently said she didn't think so. Mabel simply shrugged and replied, "Good, her house smells like carpet cleaner." Garrett laughed from the hallway, the first genuine laugh either of them had shared in days, and Fiona realized how long tension had occupied every corner of their home. Later that night, they sat together on the back porch listening to crickets, while warm summer air drifted through the backyard. Garrett reminded Fiona of something her mother once told him years earlier, that Fiona was the practical one. At the time it sounded almost complimentary, but now Fiona understood it had never described her personality. It described her assigned function inside the family structure. Practical meant reliable, practical meant useful, practical meant available on demand. Garrett squeezed her hand and quietly corrected the definition in his eyes. Practical meant building a company from nothing, creating security for their children, designing homes and offices and libraries that would outlast everyone who underestimated her. Fiona leaned against him and admitted she wasn't planning the wire transfers out of revenge. She was doing it for Mabel and Theo. She wanted her children to grow up never believing love had to be earned through sacrifice and overperformance. She wanted them to understand they could exist in a family without becoming a resource inside it. The following day, Fiona drove to her parents' house to collect a box of Mabel's old baby clothes her mother had stored in the attic. The house was empty because everyone was attending yet another wedding. Walk through the moment she stepped inside, the familiar smell of cinnamon and floor polish hit her with unexpected force. For most of her life, she associated that scent with safety and home. Now she realized it had only been branding, emotional staging, no different from the carefully decorated Airbnb listing upstairs. While searching for the box in the attic, Fiona noticed her mother's office drawer hanging slightly open downstairs. She had no intention of snooping, but a visible folder tab caught her attention. Family management. The phrase alone made her stomach tighten. Inside the folder sat printed spreadsheets covered in her mother's precise handwriting, columns labeled name, what they gave, what they received, and balance. Fiona froze as she scanned the rows. Her own name listed beside years of contributions, tax filings, golf memberships, insurance claims, contractor coordination, venue permits, kitchen renovation, oversight, florist management. Under received, her mother had written things like Christmas gifts, Thanksgiving dinners, birthday calls. At the bottom of Fiona's section appeared a handwritten note in sharp cursive. Over delivering Kelsey's row included social media management, RSVPs, event coordination, and beside her balance column, her mother had written on track. Their father's line referenced household maintenance and yard work alongside a note indicating golf memberships funded via Fiona. Fiona stood in silence, staring at proof that her mother literally quantified relationships with her children through measurable output, and returned there it was in black ink, years of emotional labor translated into performance reviews. She photographed every page carefully before returning the folder exactly where she found it. Driving home, her hands shook so badly she stayed under the speed limit the entire way. When Garrett saw the photos later that evening, he went silent for a long time before quietly saying, "Your mother doesn't have favorite children. She has a spreadsheet." The sentence landed with terrifying precision. Fiona realized then that her entire life had been shaped by an invisible scoring system she never agreed to participate in. She immediately called Claudia again and increased the trusts for Mabel and Theo to $500,000 each, fully protected and irrevocable. Then she created something else, an annual architecture scholarship called the Balance Fund for students who grew up in families where love was transactional and achievement became survival. If her mother insisted on keeping score, Fiona decided she would create a different kind of balance sheet, one that gave exhausted young people opportunities instead of obligations. That night she stood in the kitchen sunlight she had intentionally designed to hit the island at exactly that angle during summer evenings, and she realized something profound. She and Her mother were builders, but they built entirely different things. Fiona built structures designed to shelter people. Her mother built systems designed to evaluate them. On the 11th day, rehearsal dinner photos flooded Instagram. White lights, expensive floral arrangements. Fiona herself had coordinated, elegant, champagne-colored dresses. Kelsey smiling beside Trent while captions celebrated the people who matter most. Fiona noticed she had not only been excluded from the event, but erased from the narrative entirely. Friends and relatives began texting in confusion, asking why she wasn't there. Nora called and pointed out that Kelsey had tagged every family member in her posts except Fiona. Archived, that was the word Nora used, but Fiona corrected her quietly. I was never in the directory. She said I was in the vendor list. Every centerpiece in those photographs existed because of her labor, every permit approval, every logistical success, every smooth detail. Fiona's fingerprints were everywhere in the wedding except the guest list itself. And sitting alone at her laptop that night, staring at the glow of the screen in a silent house, Fiona finally began drafting the boundary letter that would close the account permanently. Fiona spent most of the night sitting at her drafting desk, rewriting the same letter over and over again, building sentences the way she built structures, carefully, precisely, making sure every line could hold weight without collapsing under pressure. She wasn't someone who made emotional decisions quickly. Architects survived by trusting measurements, stress calculations, and long-term stability, not by reacting impulsively when foundations cracked. But this family had spent 34 years teaching her that her value existed only through service, and now for the first time in her life, she was preparing to make a decision that did not come from her mother's endless queue of assignments. Around 2 in the morning, the house was silent except for the scratching of her pen and the occasional hum of the refrigerator downstairs. Fiona opened the folder on her phone labeled Architecture, the place where she stored things she needed to understand structurally. Inside were the screenshots that had rewritten her understanding of her family, the Airbnb listing of her childhood room with the decorative pillow labeled guest, Kelsey's text uninviting her from the wedding because arriving empty-handed would be awkward for everyone, the family group chat where her mother casually explained there was no point keeping the room empty if she's not contributing anymore. And finally, the spreadsheet, the balance sheet of human worth her mother had secretly maintained for years, cataloging every favor, every gift, every contribution, every emotional transaction, like quarterly performance reviews for her own children. Fiona stared at those screenshots while Garrett came downstairs wearing an old college t-shirt and sat quietly beside her. He told her she didn't have to go through with any of it, but Fiona realized that was exactly why she needed to. For the first time in nearly a decade, she was making a choice that wasn't about fixing someone else's crisis or maintaining someone else's comfort. She opened the wire transfer app and entered 3 amounts: $50,000 each for her mother, father, and sister. In the memo field, she typed a single sentence: from the woman you wrote off. But even then, she couldn't press send. In the middle of the night, she closed the app because she believed demolition should never happen in darkness. Structures deserved daylight before collapse. Before going upstairs, she stood one final time in front of the refrigerator, staring at Kelsey's wedding invitation hanging beneath the sunflower magnet, cream paper, gold lettering. 5 months of pretending she still belonged somewhere inside that family. Fiona left it hanging for one last night because part of her still mourned the illusion. Morning arrived quietly at 6:15. She sat alone at the kitchen table wearing the gray blazer she had worn while signing the $40 million acquisition papers. The fabric still smelled faintly like Claudia's office, leather chairs, expensive paper. Ambition. Her hands remained steady as she opened the banking app again. 3 transfers, 3 taps, $50,000 each from the woman you wrote off. Send. The moment the transfers cleared, Fiona felt something strange settle inside her. Not revenge, not satisfaction, but the cold finality of paperwork completed correctly, like signing off on a demolition permit after months of structural inspection. Necessary, permanent, irreversible. Then she simply made coffee and waited. The reactions began less than an hour later. Her father texted, first confused and disoriented, asking only Fiona, "What is this?" The message lacked punctuation, emotion, or context, like a man receiving instructions outside his normal chain of command. Kelsey followed shortly afterward, demanding to know why she had suddenly received $50,000 days before her wedding. Then came her mother's phone call. Fiona let it ring until voicemail answered. Her mother's voice sounded offended rather than concerned, sharp and irritated, like someone whose accounting system had suddenly malfunctioned. "You call me back right now?" she snapped. "What is this about?" The reaction fascinated Fiona. Because none of them asked whether she was okay, none of them asked if she needed help even after receiving more money than Fiona had ever directly given them before. Their immediate instinct was still demanding explanations rather than expressing gratitude or concern. By breakfast, Garrett was downstairs flipping pancakes, while Mabel sat on his hip and Theo dragged his stuffed elephant across the floor. The normalcy of the moment felt surreal beside the emotional earthquake unfolding inside her. Phone. Garrett asked how she felt. Fiona answered honestly, like filing a demolition permit, clean, necessary, and irreversible. He nodded because he understood exactly what she meant. Before eating, Fiona walked calmly to the refrigerator and removed the wedding invitation. She didn't throw it in the trash, she placed it in the recycling bin instead. Garrett watched silently as she explained that she believed materials deserve the chance to become something useful again, even after failing in their original purpose. It sounded like she was talking about paper, but both of them understood. She was really talking about herself. Over the next several hours, her mother left 6 separate voicemails, each one cycling through a different emotional strategy: confusion, demands, tears, threats, bargaining, then anger again. Fiona listened to all of them carefully and noticed something devastatingly consistent. Every message focused entirely on how Fiona's actions affected them. Not once did her mother ask why Fiona felt hurt enough to do this. Not once did she apologize for the Airbnb listing, the uninvitation, the silence, or the years of transactional treatment. Her mother behaved exactly like a CEO blindsided by an employee resignation. She believed impossible. Kelsey's messages were no better. She accused Fiona of trying to ruin her wedding week and embarrassing the family before guests arrived. Trent apparently thought the entire thing was really weird, which somehow made the situation feel even colder. Fiona's father sent one final message pleading for an explanation, but even his confusion carried the same passive energy that defined his role in the family for decades. By noon, Nora called to report that Fiona's mother had begun contacting extended family members, asking whether Fiona was having a breakdown. Another screenshot from the private family group chat arrived shortly afterward. Fiona read her mother's message, saying she sent us each $50,000. I think she's lost it. Kelsey wondered whether Fiona had secretly received some kind of settlement. Her father suggested leaving her alone. What stunned Fiona most was that not one person considered the possibility that the acquisition had succeeded. In their minds, Fiona simply wasn't someone capable of generating that kind of wealth or authority. The family system had assigned her the role of operations years ago, and operations departments did not become powerful enough to reshape the company. They fixed problems quietly behind the scenes. They certainly did not close $40 million deals. That realization finally pushed Fiona to send the message she had been drafting all night. At exactly 2 in the afternoon, she opened a group text with her mother, father, and Kelsey and wrote with the same clinical precision she used in professional project closeout reports. She informed them that the acquisition of Myers Design Group had officially closed 12 days earlier for $14 million and that the deal had never fallen through. She explained that she lied about the failure to see how they would respond when they believed she could no longer provide value. Then she listed the evidence calmly: the Airbnb listing, the wedding uninvitation, the unanswered calls, the spreadsheet tracking family contributions. Finally, she explained that the $50,000 each was severance compensation for years spent functioning as an unpaid service provider rather than a loved family member. She informed them that permanent boundaries were now being established and instructed them not to contact Garrett or come to their home. When she finished, she read the message once, pressed send, placed her phone inside a kitchen drawer, and closed it. Garrett later read a copy from their shared notes app and quietly told her it was the most architect-style message he had ever seen. Final deliverable submitted, account closed. The fallout arrived immediately through extended family gossip and forwarded screenshots. Her mother accused Fiona of setting them up. Kelsey insisted she couldn't believe her own sister would do this days before the wedding. Her father finally suggested they talk about this as a family, a sentence so painfully ironic that Fiona nearly laughed. For 6 days he had ignored her calls and allowed the system to erase her, but now that the structure itself was collapsing, he suddenly wanted dialogue. That evening her mother called again from a different number. Fiona answered only once. Her mother cried dramatically, asking how Fiona could do this to her father and sister right before the wedding. Every sentence centered their Suffering their embarrassment, their inconvenience, Fiona interrupted quietly and reminded her mother that she had listed her childhood bedroom online within 4 days of believing her daughter had lost everything. Her mother defended herself by calling it practical. Fiona calmly pointed out that she had replaced her daughter's name plaque with a decorative pillow labeled "Guest." Silence followed for several seconds before her mother delivered the sentence Fiona had heard her entire life in different forms. "You always make everything about you." Fiona closed her eyes and answered with a steadiness that surprised even herself. "For the first time in my life, this actually is about me." Then she hung up. Her hands did not shake afterward. They remained steady, architect's hands, good for measuring foundations and recognizing when structures could no longer be repaired safely. Kelsey never called. She only texted angrily that Fiona had ruined her wedding. Weak Fiona didn't bother responding, because she finally understood something important. Kelsey wasn't grieving a sister, she was grieving the loss of a service provider who stopped working without permission. Fiona had never truly been expected to attend the wedding as family. Her role had been to build the event quietly and disappear before photographs were taken. Later that night, Fiona's father left one final voicemail. His voice cracked in a way she had never heard before, genuine and frightened and painfully human for the first time since all of this began. Fiona paused before deleting it. By the second month, Fiona finally understood something painful about families built on transactions. They never believe you are hurt until your absence becomes expensive. Her father's voicemail stayed saved but unanswered. She replayed it twice late at night while sitting in the quiet kitchen after Garrett and the kids had gone to sleep. "Fiona, I love you," he had said in a cracked, exhausted voice. But even then, he never apologized. He never acknowledged what happened. Instead, he asked the same question everyone in that family eventually asked when the structure started collapsing around them. "Can't we just go back to normal?" Normal, the word echoed through her head like an old building settling under too much weight. Normal meant Fiona solved problems nobody thanked her for. Normal meant her mother treated love like project management and her sister treated support like an entitlement package. Normal meant her father floated quietly through the system, forwarding emotional requests without ever challenging the architecture itself. Normal meant Fiona worked, delivered, fixed, managed, filed, paid, coordinated, sacrificed, and smiled while nobody once stopped to ask whether she was tired. She was done with normal. The morning after the wire transfers, her phone notified her that all 3 payments had been deposited. Her mother cashed the $50,000 first before 9:30 in the morning. Kelsey deposited hers before lunch. Her father deposited his shortly after 1 o'clock. All 3 accepted the money within 18 hours while simultaneously calling Fiona manipulative, unstable, cruel, dramatic, and selfish. Garrett stared at the deposit confirmations for a long moment before quietly saying the one thing Fiona could not stop thinking afterward. "They measured your worth in dollars, and then they proved it." Day 14 was Kelsey's wedding. Fiona did not attend. She did not watch the live stream. She did not check the venue page, but the photographs found her anyway, because people always photograph beautiful structures even when they ignore the workers who built them. Instagram filled with images from the Davenport estate, white string lights glowing against the evening sky, champagne glasses raised beneath climbing roses, low floral centerpieces arranged perfectly to accommodate the ceiling height. Fiona had personally calculated weeks earlier every elegant detail inside that wedding existed partly because of her labor, her problem-solving, her expertise, her unpaid hours, and yet her name appeared nowhere in the room. Kelsey posted smiling photos with captions about love, family, and the people who matter most. Fiona stared at the screen for a long moment before closing the app. Her mother's spreadsheet floated back into her mind, the balance column, the ratings, the notation beside Fiona's name. Over-delivering. Fiona realized with cold clarity that even her goodbye had become transactional. She had given each of them $50,000 more money than her mother had budgeted for the entire wedding contribution, and they accepted every dollar before walking into the celebration. Without her, that was the final entry she needed in the ledger. Not one of them returned the money, not one refused it out of guilt or pride or shame. They took it because the system had always taught them to extract value first and process emotions second. 2 weeks later, Fiona sat once again inside Claudia's office, surrounded by the same Leather chairs and fresh paper smell that now reminded her of endings more than beginnings. Together, they finalized the legal boundary framework, not a restraining order, not a dramatic lawsuit, just a carefully structured set of formal limits drafted with the same calm professionalism Fiona brought to every project in her career. Certified letters would be mailed to each family member requesting no direct contact and instructing future communication to go through legal channels, if necessary. Claudia reviewed every line slowly before looking across the desk and saying, "This isn't punishment, Fiona. It's structure. Every building needs walls." Fiona nodded. Because architects understood boundaries better than anyone. Without them, entire systems collapse. They also finalized the trusts for Mabel and Theo, $500,000 each, protected irrevocably for education, healthcare, housing, and future stability. Fiona refused to let her children grow up believing love had to be earned through usefulness. Then came the scholarship fund, $25,000 annually for architecture students from families that treated them like resources instead of people. She called it the Balance Fund. Claudia asked why that name mattered so much. Fiona explained quietly that her mother's spreadsheet had contained a balance column measuring what every family member gave versus what they received, every relationship reduced to performance metrics and emotional accounting. "I want to build something that gives without expecting repayment," Fiona said. "No debt column, no KPIs, no ratings, just help." On the drive home, she passed the old one-room studio above the dry cleaner, where Meyer's design group had originally started 8 years earlier. The drafting tables were gone. Now a yoga studio occupied the space. But Fiona still remembered working there late into the night while simultaneously filing her parents' taxes, solving Kelsey's emergencies, covering expenses nobody else bothered handling. She built a $40 million company inside the margins of a family that saw her only as operational support. That realization hurt less now. Pain had slowly hardened into clarity. By the third week, Fiona finished the final letters herself. They were not emotional. They did not accuse, scream, or beg. She wrote them the same way. She prepared structural reports, factual, measured, impossible to argue. With paragraph 1 documented the Airbnb listing with dates, screenshots, and exact wording from the description. Paragraph 2 addressed the wedding invitation and the implication that her value depended on the size of the gift she could provide. Paragraph 3 referenced the hidden family group chat where discussions about replacing her as florist coordinator happened while she was still actively managing the wedding vendors. Paragraph 4 detailed the spreadsheet, the balance column, the performance notes, and the handwritten phrase, "over-delivering," beside her name. The final paragraph said everything she had spent years trying not to understand. "I spent 9 years functioning as a line item in this family's ledger. I built a company worth $14 million. When you believed it was gone, you closed my account in 11 days. The door is not permanently closed, but it will remain closed until you learn the difference between a daughter and a vendor." Fiona mailed the letters on a Tuesday, the same weekday she had once signed the acquisition papers. Garrett drove her to the post office in silence. Because some structures spoke loudly enough without commentary, she dropped the 3 envelopes into the mail slot and watched them disappear. Each envelope weighed less than an ounce. Each one carried nearly a decade of accumulated weight. 2 months later, her mother finally responded publicly, not through Claudia, not through private conversation, but through Facebook. Diane Myers posted a carefully worded status about the heartbreak of giving children everything only to have them walk away. Dozens of sympathy comments followed within hours. "You're such a wonderful mother. Some children never appreciate sacrifices. Praying for your family." None of those people knew about the spreadsheet. None knew Diane had literally maintained performance ratings for her own daughters. None knew the phrase over-delivering existed in her handwriting beside Fiona's name like a corporate employee review. Then the truth shifted unexpectedly one afternoon. Diane called Nora at the office demanding she tell Fiona to stop erasing her family. Nora, who had watched Fiona build an entire company from scratch while surviving emotional starvation at home, answered bluntly, "Diane, Fiona sold the company. We work for Harmon Kale." Now silence, complete silence. Then Nora added the number $14 million. The call disconnected almost immediately. Less than an hour later, Diane posted another Facebook update celebrating her daughter's incredible business success. Jess managed to screenshot it before Diane deleted the post 45 minutes later, likely realizing she could not publicly mourn abandonment and celebrate wealth in the same afternoon without exposing the contradiction. Fiona never responded. Silence became her strongest boundary. Families built on noise and emotional extraction often collapse when denied reaction. Then Kelsey finally called from her honeymoon in Turks and Caicos, her voice suddenly softer, stripped of the polished confidence she usually carried around like makeup. She admitted she had only just learned about the acquisition and quietly apologized for the wedding thing. But even inside the apology, Fiona heard the same underlying request everyone else kept making. Can we just go back to the arrangement where Fiona managed crises while everyone else enjoyed the finished product? Back to the structure, where her inclusion depended entirely on what she could contribute financially or logistically. Fiona answered with one line that ended the conversation completely. You uninvited me because Mom said I couldn't afford a gift. There is nothing to go back to. Kelsey called it unfair. Fiona didn't reply because fairness had never existed inside that system to begin with. Later that evening, Trent called Garrett, trying to mediate, politely asking whether everyone could simply talk this out. Garrett answered more directly than Fiona ever would have. Your wife uninvited my wife while my wife was still managing her wedding. Vendors were beyond talking. Trent never called again. What haunted Fiona most was not the cruelty itself, but the realization that Kelsey's apology depended entirely on discovering Fiona was wealthy. If the acquisition truly had failed, nothing would have changed. The wedding still would have happened. Without her, the room still would have become an Airbnb. The spreadsheet still would have tracked her declining usefulness. The only thing that changed was the number attached to her name, and now that the number was large enough to impress them, they suddenly wanted reconciliation. But Fiona finally understood something her mother never did. Love measured by value is not love at all. It is accounting. By the third month, the silence around Fiona had changed shape. In the beginning, it was sharp and violent, the kind of silence that follows betrayal, where every unanswered call feels deliberate, and every empty space feels like punishment. But now the quiet felt different, cleaner, like a building after demolition crews finally clear the debris, and all that remains is open ground waiting for something better to be built. Then one rainy Thursday morning, two things arrived in the same week, and together they cracked something open inside her that she thought had already hardened permanently. The first was a handwritten letter from her father, not an email, not a forwarded message through her mother, not a voicemail asking to go back to normal, an actual letter written carefully on lined paper with handwriting that trembled slightly in places. Fiona sat at the kitchen island, turning the envelope over in her hands before opening it, because she recognized immediately what it cost him to send something without permission from the system he had lived inside his entire marriage. The letter was short, painfully honest in a way her father had never learned to be. Aloud, he admitted he should have called her back. He admitted he should have asked about her company years before things collapsed. He admitted he routed everything through Diane because it was easier than standing independently inside the family structure. Then came the sentence that made Fiona finally cry for the first time since day 7. I love you, he wrote. I just never learned how to love anyone without instructions. Fiona stared at those words, while tears slid silently down her face and dropped onto the paper in perfectly straight lines. Architect tears controlled even while breaking. Garrett read the letter later that night, standing beside the stove while dinner simmered behind him. He looked at her for a long time afterward before saying quietly, "It's real." Fiona nodded because she knew that was the tragedy of it. Her father genuinely loved her, but love without action was still structurally unsound. It was a blueprint with no foundation beneath it, beautiful on paper, useless in a storm. Fiona wrote him back by hand that same evening. She told him she believed he loved her, but belief alone could not rebuild a collapsed structure. She told him to start therapy, to acknowledge the spreadsheet, to stop hiding behind Diane's routing system. And then she ended the letter with the clearest boundary she had ever set in her life. When you are ready to do the work, call Claudia, not me. Claudia. The second thing that arrived that week was a package addressed not to Fiona, but to Mabel. Inside was a pale blue stuffed rabbit with soft ears and stitched black eyes tied around one ear. Was a tiny handwritten tag that simply read, "From Grandma." No manipulation, no explanation, no guilt, no request. For 3 seconds, Fiona saw her mother not as a system, not as a manager, not as the woman who tracked human relationships through spreadsheets and balance columns, but simply as a grandmother who missed her granddaughter and bought her a toy because she had nowhere else to put that grief. It was the most human thing Diane Myers had done in months. Then Fiona noticed there was no return. address on the package. Even now, the gift had been routed carefully around direct emotional contact. Even affection arrived through controlled channels. Fiona placed the rabbit quietly on Mabel's bed and said nothing else about it. By month 4, more small cracks began appearing in the old system. Jess texted one morning saying the Airbnb listing was gone. Fiona checked for herself. The Garden View suite had disappeared completely after 17 reviews and a 4.8-star rating. 17 strangers had slept in the room that once held her childhood trophies, her architecture sketches, her window seat built by hand with her father's tools. 17 strangers had unknowingly occupied the space where Fiona once believed she belonged, and now the listing was gone like it had never existed at all. Fiona expected to feel victorious seeing it disappear, but instead, she only felt empty space where the listing used to be. A digital vacancy, mirroring the emotional vacancy that room now represented. Around the same time, Diane quietly deleted the dramatic Facebook post about heartbreak and ungrateful children. The performance had ended because the audience stopped responding. Greg reported that the family group chat had gone almost silent. Kelsey only reposted wedding photos occasionally. Roger stopped showing up regularly at the golf club. Diane herself had become strangely absent from social media entirely. Then one afternoon, Nora ran into Diane at the grocery store standing alone beside the Apple's Inn. The produce section. Diane apparently looked smaller, somehow less polished, like a corporate building after its company logo had been stripped from the front entrance. The structure still stood, but the identity attached to it was gone. Diane asked Nora softly to tell Fiona she had removed the Airbnb listing. Nora, who had watched Fiona nearly destroy herself trying to earn love through usefulness for years, answered directly, "Tell her yourself." Diane replied that Fiona wouldn't take her calls anymore. Nora simply said that's the point. When Nora later repeated the conversation over lunch, Fiona listened quietly without responding. She did not call her mother afterward. She did not reward the gesture with reconciliation. Instead, she returned home, sat at her drafting desk, and opened a brand new project file for a pro bono community arts center in Bridgeport. It was the first building she designed entirely after the acquisition and the family collapse. Something about the work felt lighter. Now she wasn't designing from obligation anymore. She wasn't proving her value. She wasn't building inside emotional debt. The rainy season of her life had finally ended, and somehow she was still standing. The family system had shut down, and yet she remained exactly who she always was, a builder. Month 5 settled into something that almost resembled peace. Fiona began consulting 3 days a week for Harman Kale's sustainable design division, advising on green certified projects across the Northeast. The methodology remained hers, even if the company name on the presentations had changed. The other 2 weekdays belonged entirely to Mabel and Theo. They built blanket forts in the living room, cardboard cities across the dining room floor, impossible towers from magnetic tiles. Theo started calling her the Builder Lady, which Garrett pointed out was probably the most accurate job title anyone had ever given her. The community arts center slowly took shape under her hands. Large windows for natural light, reading alcoves designed intentionally for quiet children, wide gathering spaces without barriers or locked doors. Fiona noticed one afternoon that every room she designed now centered around openness instead of control. Even her architecture was healing. When Mabel turned 6, they hosted a backyard birthday party with 14 screaming children, a rented bouncy castle, paper decorations, lemonade, and Garrett anchoring equipment with sandbags because the weather forecast predicted wind. Nora and Greg came. Claudia brought her daughter. Nobody from Fiona's biological family attended. Nobody needed to. At one point, Garrett raised a plastic cup of lemonade across the picnic table and toasted to the woman who built a $40 million company and a family that actually shows up. Fiona laughed softly and tapped her cup against his. To closing the ledger, she replied, "Some accounts are not worth keeping open," and for the first time in years, she meant it without bitterness. The trusts were funded. The scholarship was active. The first Balance Fund recipient would be announced the following semester. The legal boundaries remained intact. The architecture of her new life was unfinished because all worthwhile structures constantly evolved, but the foundation was finally stable. The load-bearing walls were standing. Fiona looked around the backyard that evening, children bouncing wildly inside inflatable walls, Garrett flipping burgers at the grill, Nora laughing too loudly at something Greg said. Mabel Proudly showing Claudia's daughter the cardboard city they built together on Tuesday afternoon. This was family, not the version tracked on spreadsheets or balanced through emotional accounting, but the version built slowly through presence consistency and care. No KPIs, no balance columns, no performance reviews, just people who showed up because they wanted to, not because they needed something repaired. Eventually, Fiona learned how everyone's story ended. Diane returned the original $50,000 wire transfer nearly 3 months after depositing it, accompanied by a note insisting she never needed the money, but she kept every dollar earned from the Airbnb listing. 17 guests at $89 a night. Fiona noticed the contradiction immediately and never commented on it. Diane still refused therapy, still never acknowledged the spreadsheet directly, still never contacted Claudia about reconciliation work. Kelsey and Trent disappeared quietly into married life. Friends who attended the wedding admitted privately that the event felt incomplete without Fiona there, but Kelsey herself never reached out again after the honeymoon voicemail. Instead, she unfollowed Fiona online and returned fully to the system because questioning the structure would require admitting she benefited from it too. Roger surprised everyone slightly. He contacted Claudia once, asking what doing the work actually meant. Claudia gave him 3 therapist referrals. He booked an appointment with the second therapist on the list, and most importantly, respected every boundary afterward. He never bypassed Claudia, never showed up unexpectedly, never asked Diane to intervene for him. It was the first decision he had made independently inside the family structure in decades. Fiona noticed even from a distance. In the end, the $150,000 never mattered. Most of it was returned or donated. Eventually, the money had only been documentation, evidence proving exactly what happened when usefulness disappeared. Inside a family built on transactions, Fiona stopped checking for updates after that. Greg no longer forwarded screenshots. The group chat no longer mattered. That entire system had gone offline permanently, and in the quiet that followed, Fiona built something better. She used to believe family meant permanent load-bearing wall structures you could never remove without collapsing the entire house, but architecture had taught her something different. Over the years, some walls are load-bearing, others are only partitions installed by people who wanted control over movement and visibility. Diane Myers spent her life building systems, org charts, balance columns, and invisible performance reviews. She managed her family like a corporation, and corporations eventually lay people off when they stop generating value. Fiona stopped being useful, so she stopped being family. But when she finally tore down the partitions, the house didn't collapse at all. It breathed, and for the first time in her life, Fiona understood the difference between being needed and being loved.